She looked like the kind of person the station had already forgotten. Ethan Coles saw her from 50 feet away, half hidden behind a frost-coated water tank at the edge of Cinder Gate Refugee Annex, where the metal walls never stopped groaning and the red dust of Mars scraped across the siding like sandpaper on bone. The emergency lamps above the service lane flickered in tired pulses, turning everything amber, then black, then amber again. In that broken rhythm, she barely looked real. Just a thin figure folded into herself beneath a torn gray thermal wrap, shoulders tight against the cold, dark hair blown across her face by the draft leaking through the outer seal. Ethan had spent 6 years fixing heat exchangers, oxygen scrubbers, and cracked pressure valves for people nobody important ever visited, and he had learned one thing about suffering: it was usually loud. Crying kids. Shouting officers. Air alarms. Hungry people pounding on locked ration doors. But this woman was silent, and somehow that made her stand out more. He slowed, tool case in one hand, breath fogging inside the collar of his work jacket. The station clock above Bay 3 blinked 2:14 a.m. His shift had already run long, his left knee ached from crawling under a blown intake manifold, and the last thing he needed was one more problem with a pulse. Still, he stopped. Up close, she looked even worse. Bare hands. No gloves. No station tag. Dust dried along the side of her jaw like she had come in through weather instead of a docking arm. Her feet were wrapped in strips of emergency insulation, already graying at the edges. Refugee, he thought. Fresh arrival. Probably screened, processed, misplaced, then abandoned in the shuffle between one authority and the next. It happened more than people liked to admit. Her head lifted at the sound of his boots, and that was when something in him caught. Her face was sharp, almost delicate, but her eyes were wrong for someone in her condition. Not wrong in a way he could explain. Just too steady. Too clear. People freezing at 2 in the morning in a failing station usually had panic in their eyes, or shame, or the flat distant look of someone shutting down by the inch. This woman had none of that. She looked at him like she was measuring the distance between what a man claimed to be and what he really was when nobody was watching. Ethan cleared his throat. "You can't stay out here," he said. His voice sounded rough, worn by dust and 12-hour shifts and coffee that tasted like burnt wiring. She didn't answer. A gust pressed through the lane, and he saw her flinch once, barely, the kind of movement a proud person made only when pain slipped past control. That was enough. He set down his tool case, unzipped his jacket, and pulled out the last heat pack from the inside pocket. He had been saving it for the walk back to his unit. Nights on Cinder Gate could drop hard, and the old transit tunnels held cold like a grudge. He cracked the packet, waited for the chemical core to wake up, then held it out. Steam rose faintly between them. "Here," he said. "Take it." Her gaze dropped to the packet, then returned to his face. When she spoke, her voice was low and precise, almost too calm for the hour. "Why would you give that to me?" Ethan let out a tired breath and glanced up at the flickering light above them. "Because you're freezing," he said. For the first time, something shifted behind her eyes. Not gratitude. Not yet. Just surprise, small and quiet, like a door inside her had opened a single inch. Then she reached for the heat pack, and the moment her fingers brushed his, every light in the service lane went dead. Darkness hit the lane so completely that for half a second Ethan thought the station had lost power again. Then the backup strips along the floor blinked on in a dull red line, thin as a wound and just bright enough to paint the pipes and wall seams in shadow. The woman did not move. She was still holding the heat pack in both hands, looking down at it as if the outage had answered a question she had not asked out loud. Ethan looked up at the dead service lamp, then at the maintenance panel bolted beside the water tank. "Great," he muttered. "That is just great." He set his tool case on the ground, popped the latches, and pulled out a handheld meter with a cracked screen. The station had been failing in small ways for months. Doors lagged. Heaters coughed. Circuits browned out whenever too many people used the same grid. Cinder Gate was held together by sealant, overtime, and denial. Still, this felt different. The light had not flickered. It had stopped. Clean. Instant. As if someone had pulled the idea of electricity right out of the wire. He crouched by the panel and pressed the meter leads against the service ports. 0 draw. 0 fault tone. 0 anything. Behind him, the woman spoke again. Does your station often go silent when touched? Ethan glanced back over one shoulder. No, he said. Usually it waits until I have paperwork. That earned the smallest change in her expression. Not a smile. More like she had recognized humor as a tool and was still deciding what humans used it for. He shut the panel and stood. The wind leaking through the outer seal came sharper now, cutting through his jacket and across the lane in little knives of cold. He looked at her hands around the warming packet. Her fingers were long, too still, the nails strangely pale beneath the red backup glow. There was dust on her sleeve, but none on the skin at her wrist, like the storm had touched the fabric and avoided her. He should have called station security. That was the smart move. Unregistered arrival. Unexplained outage. A woman who looked half frozen and somehow completely in control of herself. Every training bulletin on every maintenance terminal would have told him the same thing. Report the anomaly. Preserve your clearance. Protect yourself first. Instead, Ethan heard himself say, there is an empty repair bay 2 levels down. Heat still works when the boiler feels generous. You can sit there until morning. Her eyes lifted to his face again, studying him with that unnerving stillness. And if I am dangerous? She asked. A pressure door groaned somewhere deeper in the annex. Loose sheet metal rattled overhead. Ethan bent to pick up his tool case and slung the strap across his shoulder. Then this has been a terrible career decision, he said. But you still look cold. For a moment she said nothing. Then she rose. She was taller than he expected, though the movement was so smooth it almost erased the fact that she had been shivering a minute earlier. The torn thermal wrap slipped at one shoulder, and under it Ethan caught a glimpse of dark fabric that did not look station-made, fine-threaded and seamless, with a faint sheen like oil under starlight. Not refugee issue. Not even close. He noticed it. He knew she saw him notice it. Neither of them said a word. Ethan started down the service lane, boots thudding softly on the grated floor. After one breath, then two, he heard her footsteps follow. They passed under another dead light, then another. At the far end of the corridor, a station screen crackled to life for 1 second before dissolving into static, and in that white hiss a warning banner tried to load across the glass. Ethan caught only 3 readable words before it vanished: inbound security search. The warning vanished so fast Ethan almost convinced himself he had imagined it, but the cold feeling in his stomach stayed. He kept walking, tool case bumping lightly against his leg, while the woman moved beside him with a silence that did not fit the station. Cinder Gate always made noise. Air recyclers hummed behind the walls. Floor grates ticked as heat pushed through old pipes. Loose panels complained every time the pressure shifted. Even in the middle of the night, the place sounded tired and alive. But around her, Ethan kept noticing strange little pockets of quiet, as if the station itself were listening. They turned into a narrower service corridor where the ceiling dropped low enough for exposed conduit to run just overhead. Red backup lights threw long shadows across the pipes, and every few yards a maintenance stencil flashed by on the wall in chipped white paint. Boiler feed. Water reclamation. Auxiliary heat. All the unglamorous systems that kept forgotten people from freezing. Ethan keyed open a side hatch and motioned her through. The repair bay beyond was not much to look at, just a square room with a dented workbench, 2 stackable polymer chairs, shelves full of filters and sealant cartridges, and a wall heater that only worked if you kicked the lower panel once. He did that now with the side of his boot. The heater rattled, coughed, and then began pushing out a thin current of warm air that smelled faintly of hot dust. "Luxury accommodations," Ethan said. The woman stood in the doorway for a second, eyes moving over the room. Not curious. Calculating. As if every object had a use she could already see. Ethan set down his case, crossed to the sink unit, and filled a metal cup from the potable line. He held it out to her. "It is clean enough to survive," he said. She accepted it with both hands, and again that strange restraint in her face slipped just enough for him to notice it. "You speak as if survival is the highest promise this place offers," she said. Ethan gave a tired half-laugh and leaned back against the workbench. "At this hour, it usually is." She drank without taking her eyes off him. Up close, with the heater pushing a little color back into the room, she looked less like someone broken by travel and more like someone wearing hardship with deliberate precision. Her features were too composed. Her posture too exact. Even the way she held the cup felt practiced, as though she had studied how tired people were supposed to move and had mastered it without ever becoming one. Ethan tried not to stare at the dark fabric beneath the torn wrap, the seamless material that caught the light without reflecting it. Not station issue. Not military either. Something else. Something expensive, or old, or both. He opened a storage drawer, dug out an emergency ration bar, and set it on the bench between them. "Eat," he said. "You look like you missed dinner." She looked down at the ration pack but did not touch it right away. "And what do you miss by giving this to me?" she asked. Ethan shrugged. "Breakfast, maybe." That answer seemed to land harder than he expected. Her gaze shifted from the ration bar to his face, and for one quiet second the room felt smaller, the heater louder, the air sharper. "You measure cost quickly," she said. "Everybody here does," Ethan replied. "That is what happens when supplies run on hope and a bad budget." At last she opened the pack. The foil peeled back with a soft crackle, and she broke off a piece with careful fingers, studying the inside as if even processed protein told a story. Ethan watched her take one small bite. Most refugees he had seen tore through food like they were afraid someone would take it back. She ate slowly, thoughtfully, almost respectfully. It made him more uneasy, not less. He crossed to the wall terminal and tapped it awake, meaning to pull a maintenance log and maybe check weather. Security had actually issued a search alert. The screen flickered, rolled static, then cleared into a sealed station bulletin bordered in yellow. Authorized personnel only. Ethan should have looked away. Instead, he read the first line. Unregistered entity suspected within Annex 6. Avoid direct contact. Report unusual electrical interference immediately. He felt the blood drain from his face before he could stop it. Behind him, the woman set down the cup with a soft metallic click. "That message," she said quietly. "Is it about me?" Ethan did not answer right away. He stared at the screen, at the words unusual electrical interference, at the yellow border trembling under weak power, and then he heard something else out in the corridor beyond the hatch. Footsteps. More than one set. Slow. Methodical. Getting closer. The footsteps stopped just outside the hatch, and for a moment the whole repair bay seemed to hold its breath with Ethan. The heater rattled in the corner. Air moved through the vent above the sink with a faint dry hiss. Somewhere deeper in the wall, old pipes clicked as hot water changed direction. Ordinary sounds. Small sounds. But now each one landed too hard, as if the room had become aware of being searched. Ethan reached over and killed the terminal screen with the flat of his hand. The yellow warning disappeared, leaving only his reflection in the dark glass, pale and tense and more afraid than he wanted to admit. He turned toward the woman. She was still by the workbench, one hand near the empty cup, the other resting lightly against the edge of the table. Not bracing. Not panicking. Just waiting. The composure in her face made the question hanging between them feel sharper. "I do not think that message was random," she said. Her voice stayed low, almost gentle, but there was no confusion in it now. Ethan listened to the silence beyond the hatch, then stepped closer and lowered his own voice. "I do not know who you are," he said. "But I know the station does not send security teams into Annex 6 after 2 in the morning unless somebody important is scared." One corner of her expression shifted. Not quite approval. Not quite regret. "And are you?" she asked. Ethan gave a dry, humorless smile. "Scared? Yes. Everybody with a job and rent is scared." The line should have sounded lighter than it did, but his chest was too tight for that. He moved to the shelf beside the heater and started gathering things without fully thinking it through. A spare thermal blanket. A clean filter cloth. A small maintenance flashlight with a weak battery. The kind of items that made sense only if a person had already decided not to hand someone over. He noticed that too late to pretend otherwise. The woman watched him as he folded the blanket once and held it out. "Take this," he said. "If they look in, they will see a tired maintenance tech and somebody warming up before transfer paperwork." She looked at the blanket instead of his face. "You are helping me before you know whether I deserve it," she said. "That is usually how help works," Ethan replied. He meant it to sound casual, but the words came out heavier than expected, worn smooth by years of seeing people sorted into columns by category, risk, labor value, transport priority, medical burden. Deserve had become one of the ugliest words on the station. She accepted the blanket, and as she drew it around her shoulders the torn outer wrap slipped enough for Ethan to see more of the garment beneath. Dark silver. Seamless. Not stitched, not bonded, almost grown. It fit her like it remembered her. No refugee came through Cinder Gate wearing something like that. He looked away before the thought could finish building. Outside, a voice spoke through the corridor, muffled by steel and distance. "Maintenance sector check. Open all side rooms." Ethan froze. Then he crossed the bay in 3 quick steps and pressed the manual lock on the hatch, not enough to seal it, just enough to make it drag when opened. By seconds. Maybe 10. Maybe less. He turned back. "Listen carefully," he said. "There is a crawlspace behind the condensers. It is cramped, filthy, and smells like burned plastic, but they might miss it if they are lazy." Her eyes stayed on him, unblinking. "And if they are not lazy?" Ethan picked up his tool case and set it on the bench with more confidence than he felt. "Then I tell them I found you half conscious near the service lane and I was waiting for medical." "That would be false," she said. "Welcome to survival," Ethan answered. For the first time, something warmer than surprise touched her face. It was not softness. It was recognition, as if she had finally found a language under all the words he had been using. The hatch handle jerked once from the other side. A hard metallic sound. Then a second pull, firmer this time. Ethan stepped in front of her before he had time to question why. He did not spread his arms or make a show of it. He just moved there, one ordinary man in a stained work jacket putting himself between a stranger and a locked door. The room went still again. Then the woman behind him said, quiet enough that he almost missed it, "You have not asked my name." Ethan kept his eyes on the hatch. "Felt rude under the circumstances," he said. Another pull rattled the latch. The heater coughed. The red backup light above the sink flickered once, twice, then steadied. Behind him, after a silence that felt older than the station itself, she answered at last. "Soralia," she said. And the moment she spoke her name, every loose screw and metal tool in the room gave a tiny, singing tremor. The tools stopped trembling a second before the hatch handle jerked again, and that frightened Ethan more than the sound itself. It was the kind of silence that felt arranged, as if the room had decided to behave because Soralia had spoken and everything inside it had listened. He did not turn around. He kept his hand near the latch and his eyes on the dented steel door while his mind tried to catch up with the last 10 seconds. Sorelia. The name still seemed to hang in the air, not loud, not echoing, just present in a way names usually were not. Outside, a voice came through the hatch, sharper now. Maintenance. Open the room. Ethan swallowed once, slow. Then he shot a look over his shoulder. Sorelia stood wrapped in a thermal blanket, but she did not look hidden anymore. The blanket made her seem less like a refugee and more like something choosing, for the moment, to wear poverty as a disguise. Her face was calm. Too calm. The red emergency light over the sink touched the edge of her cheek and caught in her eyes, turning them almost metallic. Crawlspace, Ethan whispered. Now. She looked toward the condenser bank along the rear wall, then back to him. You would still conceal me, she asked. The question should have irritated him. Instead it landed with the weight of something older, as if she was not asking what he would do in this room but what his kind did when fear came wearing a uniform. Ethan took one breath and moved fast. He crossed the bay, dragged a rolling bin of old filters in front of the condenser panel, and yanked the access latch loose. Behind it was a maintenance gap barely 2 feet wide, lined with insulated pipe and dust. Tight, ugly, and probably freezing. I am not having a philosophical night, he said under his breath. Get in. For the first time since he found her, Sorelia obeyed without another question. She stepped into the narrow space with a smoothness that made no sense in a body that had looked half-frozen less than 20 minutes earlier. Ethan pulled the panel mostly shut, leaving only a breath of darkness behind it, then shoved the bin back into place. Another bang hit the hatch. Open it now. Ethan grabbed a grease rag from the workbench and wiped his hands, then smeared a little black residue across his sleeve for effect. Maintenance men always looked more believable when they looked annoyed. He unlocked the hatch and pulled it open halfway. 2 station security officers stood in the corridor under the red backup strips, both in gray cold-weather armor with scanner tablets glowing blue in their hands. They looked tired, irritated, and deeply committed to making that somebody else's problem if possible. Ethan had met their type before. You took your time, the taller one said. Ethan leaned on the hatch as if they had interrupted sacred work. I was resetting a wall heater that is older than I am, he said. You want warmth in Annex 6, you wait for me to open doors. The officer looked past him into the room. Workbench. Shelves. Heater. Sink. 1 empty cup. 1 opened ration pack. Ethan saw the man notice both. You alone? The officer asked. Ethan shrugged. Depends if the boiler counts. The shorter officer glanced at his scanner tablet. We are tracking an unregistered signal disturbance through this sector. Female presentation. Possible refugee masking profile. We have authority to inspect. Ethan felt the muscles in his back go tight, but he kept his face flat. Then inspect. He stepped aside. That was the dangerous part, he knew. Innocent men got defensive. Guilty men got careful. Tired workers got sarcastic and moved out of the way. The officers entered. Their boots clicked against the floor grate. One checked the sink area. The other swept the shelves with a handheld scanner that chirped softly each time it crossed a motor or live wire. Ethan stayed near the hatch, not blocking, not hovering, just close enough to intervene if either of them reached the condenser bank. Sorelia was maybe 6 feet behind a thin panel and a stack of condemned filters. Close enough for disaster. The shorter officer paused near the workbench and lifted the ration wrapper between 2 fingers. You sharing late meals with ghosts now, Cole? Ethan recognized his own surname in the man's voice and hated that. Familiarity made people bold. It was mine, he said. I changed my mind halfway through. Story of my life. The tall officer moved toward the back wall. One more step and he would be standing right in front of the condenser panel. Ethan felt his heartbeat rise, heavy and stupid, each thud loud enough to count. The scanner in the officer's hand began to glow brighter. Then, without warning, every device in the room shut off at once. The scanner died. The heater went silent. The overhead red light blinked out and plunged the bay into darkness so complete that one of the officers swore under his breath. And in that black, from somewhere behind the condenser panel, a voice Ethan barely recognized as Ceralia's spoke softly enough to be almost part of the dark itself. "Tell me, Ethan Cole. When your people cannot see, do they become more honest or more afraid?" For one blind second nobody moved. The darkness was so complete Ethan could hear fabric shift, hear one of the officers breathe through his nose, hear the station itself settling around them like an old ship deciding whether to keep floating. Then the shorter guard snapped. "Who said that?" His voice came out tighter than before, stripped of authority now that the glowing tools in his hands were dead weight. Ethan did not answer. He could not have explained what he had just heard even if he wanted to. Ceralia's voice had not been loud. It had not needed to be. It had moved through the room the way cold moved under a door, touching everyone at once. A second later the emergency strips along the floor blinked back to life, dimmer than before, barely enough to outline boots, chair legs, the workbench, the lower edges of the condenser bank. The tall officer looked down at his dead scanner and smacked it once against his palm. Nothing. The shorter one backed a step toward the hatch, more from instinct than decision. Ethan saw it in the angle of his shoulders. Men trusted rules when systems worked. They trusted exits when they did not. "Power fault," Ethan said, forcing his voice into the flattest tone he had. "Happens all the time in Annex 6. It was a weak lie. Everyone in the room knew it. But weak lies sometimes survived because people were desperate to accept them." The tall officer glanced toward the rear wall again, toward the condenser panel, toward the exact place Ethan needed him not to examine. "There is somebody else in here," he said. Ethan folded his arms and leaned one shoulder against the bench as if he had not just felt his heartbeat slam into his ribs. "Then your scanner should have found them before it died." That landed. Not enough to end the search, but enough to insult the man into caution. The officer did not like being reminded that his machine had failed before Ethan had. He took one more step toward the back wall anyway. Floor light skimmed across his boots, and Ethan saw the dust there ripple first. Not from wind. From vibration. Fine gray particles began to tremble in little circles around the officer's soles. The metal tools hanging above the bench answered an instant later, giving off a faint glassy hum. It was almost musical, if music could warn. Ethan pushed off the bench before he realized he had made the choice. "Do not," he said. Both officers turned toward him. So did the room, it seemed. The humming deepened. Not louder. Deeper. Ethan looked past them to the condenser bank. The thin panel he had closed was still in place, but a pale line of light had appeared around its edges, cool and silver, nothing like the red emergency strips. It spilled through the seams in quiet threads, outlining bolts, wiring, the wheel marks on the floor. The shorter officer lifted one hand as if to shield his eyes, though the light was soft. "What is that?" he whispered. Ethan did not know. The honest answer hit him so hard he almost laughed. He had spent his whole life around systems. Broken systems, patched systems, overheated systems held together with borrowed parts and stubbornness. This was not a system. This was presence. The condenser panel slid open without a sound. Ceralia stepped out wrapped in a thermal blanket, but the blanket no longer made her seem small. The dark silver garment beneath it had come alive with moving lines like starlight caught in water, tracing slow patterns across her shoulders and down her arms. The room brightened around her without any source Ethan could name. Even the dead scanner in the tall officer's hand gave one weak pulse, as if trying to recognize what stood before it and failing. Ceralia looked at the two guards first, then at Ethan. Her expression held no anger. That was the part that unsettled him most. Anger would have been familiar. This was something colder and far more patient. "I asked a question," she said. Her voice remained calm, but now it carried a strange clarity, as though every word had been cleaned of dust, fear, and anything unnecessary. "When your people lose the comfort of seeing, what do they choose next?" The tall officer opened his mouth, then closed it again. The shorter one took another step back until his shoulder touched the hatch frame. Ethan realized neither man had reached for a weapon. They were past that. The old categories had failed too fast. Uniform. Stranger. Threat. Civilian. None of them seemed to fit anymore. Sorelia turned fully toward Ethan then, and the silver light along her clothing softened, narrowing until it seemed to gather close to her skin. "You chose concealment," she said. "You chose warmth. You chose food. You chose risk without witness." Ethan stared at her, every practical thought in him reduced to fragments. "I chose not to leave somebody in the cold," he said. It was the only thing he had that was still true. Her eyes rested on him for one long second, and when she answered, the room felt suddenly larger than steel and screws and failing pipes had any right to allow. "Yes," she said. "That is why this is not over." Then every wall screen in the repair bay came to life. At once, each one flooding with the same stark white symbol Ethan had never seen before, while somewhere far above Annex 6, a station-wide alarm began to ring. The alarm did not sound like any evacuation tone Ethan had heard before. Cinder Gate had a whole language of failure built into its speakers. Hull breach. Fire suppression. Pressure loss. Riot containment. Medical quarantine. He knew them all by pitch and rhythm the way a mechanic knows the moods of an engine. This was none of those. It came in long, measured pulses, low enough to vibrate through the workbench and the pipe braces in the wall, as if the station itself had become a bell and someone far beyond it had struck metal the size of a moon. The two security officers looked up at the white symbols burning across the dead screens. Whatever training they had no longer applied. Ethan could see that much in their faces. The tall one had gone pale beneath the red corridor light. The shorter one still had one hand near the hatch, but now it looked less like caution and more like a man wanting proof that an ordinary door still existed. Sorelia stood between the condenser bank and the workbench with the silver lines across her clothing moving in slow, deliberate currents. They did not flicker like electronics. They flowed like thought. Ethan hated how natural it looked on her. As if the torn blanket, the cold hands, the dust, the refugee shape he had first seen behind the water tank had been the disguise, and this was the truth underneath, patient enough to wait until he was ready to see it. "What is that symbol?" he asked. His voice sounded smaller than he intended. Sorelia turned her gaze toward the nearest screen. The white mark on it was simple, almost severe, a circle split by 3 descending lines, like a star map reduced to judgment. "Recognition," she said. "The station has been informed that an observation is in progress." The tall officer found enough of his voice to speak. "Observation by who?" Sorelia looked at him, and the room seemed to cool a degree. "By those your species has not noticed while trying to be noticed by everyone else." The answer settled over the bay like frost. Ethan rubbed a hand over his mouth, buying half a second to think. It did not help. Nothing in his life had prepared him for this. He knew boilers. Valve compression. Cracked seals. He knew how long a cheap heater could be abused before its core split. He knew how hunger changed people in waiting lines and how lack of sleep made them crueler by noon. But this was larger than all of that, and somehow it had stepped into his repair bay wrapped in one of his station blankets. The wall screens changed without warning. The white symbol vanished, replaced by live feeds from across Annex 6. Corridor cameras. Loading gates. Intake halls. Families huddled on floor mats under emergency lighting. Children half awake in oversized coats. Volunteers passing out water pouches. Security teams sweeping rooms in careful formation. It took Ethan a second to understand what he was seeing. The station was not just an alarm. It was being watched all at once. Sorelia moved closer to one of the screens, the silver light around her softening as the images shifted. "You built places like this on every frontier," she said quietly. "Ports for labor. Shelters for the displaced. Holding cells named as relief. Your kind calls them temporary, then forgets how long temporary can become." Ethan looked from the screen to her profile. There was no anger in her tone. No accusation sharpened for effect. That made it worse. Anger could be argued with. This sounded like accounting. One of the officers swallowed audibly. "If this is some kind of inspection," he said, "then command needs to be notified." Sorelia did not even look at him. "Command has already been included." Ethan followed her gaze to the upper right corner of the central display. New windows had begun opening there, one after another, each carrying feeds from places outside the annex. Station control. Docking ring checkpoints. Cargo customs. Even the executive residence corridor 3 levels above, where climate settings never failed and polished floors reflected clean white light. Cinder Gate was being unfolded layer by layer like a body under scan. Ethan felt something unpleasant twist in his chest. Shame, maybe. Not personal exactly. Older than that. Shared. He thought of the ration lines, the broken heaters, the way whole families were asked for papers before being offered blankets. He thought of how normal it had all become. Beside him, the shorter officer finally found the courage to ask the question Ethan had been avoiding. "What are you?" Sorelia turned away from the screen. For one brief second the strange light in her clothing dimmed, and she looked almost like the woman Ethan had found in the cold. Not weaker. Just closer. "I am not your enemy," she said. Then her eyes shifted to Ethan, and something in her face changed, subtle but unmistakable, as if the next words mattered more than any that had come before. "But I was sent to determine whether your species has become its own." The alarm continued to pulse through the walls. On the central screen, one of the live camera feeds cut to the main refugee intake hall, where hundreds of people sat beneath failing heat lamps while armed personnel redirected resources toward command sectors. Ethan stared at the image, then back at Sorelia. He understood it all at once, not in detail, but in shape. This had never been about hiding one stranger from 2 officers. The room, the outage, the questions, the warmth, the food, the risk he took without knowing why she mattered, all of it had been part of something wider and more terrible than security protocol. Sorelia had not come to Cinder Gate to ask humanity for help. She had come to see who they became when helping offered no reward. And somewhere above them, beyond Mars, beyond the station, beyond everything Ethan had ever called distance, something was waiting for the answer. The central screen shifted again, and this time Ethan saw his own repair bay from above. A ceiling camera he had forgotten existed stared down at the room in grainy monochrome, catching the workbench, the officers, the dead scanner, the open hatch, and him standing in a grease-stained jacket between a stranger and the machinery of his own station. For one strange second he felt split in half. One Ethan still inside the moment, breathing stale heated air, listening to the alarm roll through steel. Another flattened onto the screen, reduced to posture and angle, just one more human shape to be interpreted by whatever waited beyond Mars. "They are watching this too," he said. Sorelia did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained on the spreading wall of live feeds as more windows opened across it. Cargo docks. Transit locks. Medical triage. Executive corridors. A supply ledger. A detention queue. A family of 4 sleeping under a silver emergency tarp while a heated conference room stood empty 3 decks above them. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, and somehow that made the words land harder. "Not this room alone," she said. "Pattern. habit, preference, allocation, mercy under inconvenience, dignity under scarcity. Your species reveals itself most clearly where comfort ends. The shorter officer stared at the screens like a man reading his own future in a language he could not understand. The taller one had stopped trying to revive his scanner. It hung useless in his hand now, a dead piece of authority. Then this is judgment, he said. Soralia turned toward him. No, she replied. Judgment comes after truth is no longer disputed. Ethan looked back at the intake hall feed. A line of exhausted people sat on the floor beneath failing heat lamps while freight elevators moved supply pallets away from them toward secured sectors. Nobody on the screen was shouting. That almost made it worse. Cruelty without noise looked like policy. It looked like normal procedure. It looked like a signature so old nobody remembered writing it. Ethan felt the shame again, deeper this time, because he knew the station would defend every choice with numbers. Heat loss percentages. Security concerns. Priority protocols. Resource efficiency. He had heard versions of those explanations his whole adult life. They always sounded clean from a terminal. They never sounded clean when a child slept in a coat. What happens now? He asked. Soralia faced him fully then, and for the first time since revealing herself, she seemed tired. Not physically. Something older than that. The silver lines moving through her clothing slowed, settling into quiet paths of light along her sleeves and collar. Now your station is given a final opportunity to declare what it values when observed, she said. As if summoned by the sentence, every screen changed again. The feeds collapsed into one official station broadcast channel framed in the blue seal of Cinder Gate Administration. A polished woman in command gray appeared, lit from above, composed in the way people trained for power learn to be. Ethan recognized Deputy Director Lena Marr from internal bulletins, usually attached to funding speeches and morale directives none of the maintenance crews believed. Tonight her smile was gone. Attention all sectors, she said. A hostile infiltration event is underway. All non-essential civilians are to remain in place. Any personnel harboring unidentified entities will be granted full amnesty and compensation upon immediate disclosure. Ethan let out a single breath through his nose. Compensation. There it was. The old lever. Offer money, offer safety, offer a cleaner story than the truth. On the screen behind Marr, a map of Annex 6 glowed in warning red. One zone pulsed brighter than the rest. Ethan did not need a caption to know it was his. The taller officer looked from the broadcast to Ethan, then to Soralia. Calculation returned to his face, clumsy but visible. Fear had found a price tag. You heard her, he said, not quite steady. This can end cleanly. Ethan turned to him slowly. Cleanly for who? The officer opened his mouth, then shut it again. He had no good answer. Few people ever did. Soralia watched Ethan with that same unnerving stillness she had carried from the first moment behind the water tank, but now he understood it better. She had not been waiting to be rescued. She had been waiting to see what rescue meant to the species that claimed to value it. The command broadcast continued. All service corridors are locked. Thermal signatures are being isolated. Cooperation will be remembered. Ethan glanced toward the hatch. A heavy clunk echoed through the corridor as remote bolts engaged. So that was the plan. Seal the annex. Scan every room. Offer reward for obedience. Dress fear up as civic responsibility and hope the right people folded fast enough. He knew that system too. He had fixed its doors for years. One of the screens split again, and now the main intake hall appeared beside Marr's broadcast. Refugees were being directed tighter together under the weakest heating banks while security rerouted power toward command lanes and scan grids. Ethan stared at the image, then at the dead heater in his bay, then back at Soralia. Something in him settled. Not bravery. He did not feel brave. Just finished with pretending that small decisions stayed small. He stepped toward the wall console, keyed open the local maintenance grid, and overrode the lockout on the annex heat valves. Warning text flashed across the terminal. Unauthorized redistribution. He ignored it and diverted power away from 3 executive corridors and into intake hall 1, 2, and 3. Somewhere in the station, expensive rooms would get colder. Down below, children would stop shivering quite so hard. The taller officer swore under his breath. Do you understand what that will cost you? Ethan kept his hand on the console. More than breakfast, he said. Then he looked at Soralia. The silver light in her eyes did not brighten, but it changed, becoming less distant, less like observation from a height and more like the first sign of respect. Outside the hatch, magnetic locks sealed again all along the corridor. Overhead, the alarm deepened into one final resonant pulse. And on every screen in the room, Deputy Director Marr paused mid-sentence as the broadcast signal bent around a second presence entering the channel, one not authorized by any human system, one that arrived without sound, without static, without permission, and shaped itself into a field of stars waiting for Soralia to speak. The stars entered the room without crossing a single inch of space. They bloomed across every screen at once, not as an image, not as a transmission, but as a depth that seemed to open behind the glass, as if the walls of the repair bay had briefly remembered what existed beyond steel, beyond orbit, beyond every border human beings had ever drawn to comfort themselves. Ethan stood with one hand still resting on the maintenance console, executive heat rerouted, intake halls warming, his pulse heavy in his throat. Deputy Director Marr was gone from the channel. The command seal was gone. The map, the warnings, the promises of compensation and amnesty, all of it had vanished under that impossible field of cold, living light. Even the station alarm stopped. Not faded. Stopped. The silence left behind was so clean it made the old heater tick sound sacred. Soralia stepped forward into that silence, the station blanket slipping from one shoulder and pooling around her arm like something temporary at last admitting it could not define her. The silver lines in her clothing lifted and brightened, tracing her form with the same patient geometry Ethan had seen in the white symbol on the screens. She no longer looked disguised, or wounded, or stranded. She looked like a truth that had spent the night moving through a human shape because that was the only way human beings ever seemed to recognize one. The 2 security officers said nothing. One had lowered his eyes. The other stared at the floor great as if ashamed to meet the room in its new condition. Ethan did not blame them. He could barely meet it himself. Soralia looked first at the stars on the screens, then at the live feed still visible in one lower corner, the intake hall where the redirected heat had already begun to change small things. Children uncurled from tight sleeping shapes. An old woman removed one of her 2 coats and laid it over the shoulders of the stranger beside her. A volunteer knelt to repair a broken thermal strip with shaking hands and a look of tired concentration Ethan recognized immediately. Nothing dramatic. No cheering. No revelation announced to the crowd. Just suffering eased by a few degrees, dignity returned in increments small enough that most people would never call them miracles. Soralia spoke, and when she did, her voice carried not only through the repair bay but through every open channel of Cinder Gate. Ethan knew that before he understood how. He saw it in the screens. Dock workers lifting their heads. Command staff going still. Families in waiting corridors turning toward speakers bolted overhead. Observation complete, she said. The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of a door closing on an age. This station has presented what your species protects when unobserved, what it withholds when afraid, and what it still chooses, in rare and costly moments, to give away. Ethan felt the words move through him harder than he wanted. Not because they were cruel. Because they were accurate. Soralia continued, her gaze settling now on him, not with affection, not exactly, but with a steadiness that made affection seem too small a term. Humanity was not weighed by its claims, she said. It was weighed by heat shared before status was known. By food offered before identity was verified. By risk accepted without promise of reward. Ethan looked away for a second, toward the workbench, the empty cup, the torn ration wrapper, his old tool case still half open on the bench where he had set it down when this was just another bad shift in Annex 6. Those things looked absurdly ordinary now. That, more than anything, nearly undid him. He had not argued for his species. He had not spoken for Earth, or Mars, or any of the polished people who signed directives from heated offices. He had just given away the last warm thing in his pocket because someone was cold. Sorelia turned back toward the stars. The room brightened by one soft degree, enough to silver the edge of every bolt and wire. The verdict is continuance, she said. Neither triumph nor relief entered her tone. It was not a gift. It was a decision. Not because humanity is innocent, but because innocence was never the measure. Continuance is granted because mercy remains possible among you, even where systems have forgotten it. The record will reflect both your indifference and your potential. You will proceed under witness. Across the screens, the field of stars shifted, as though some vast attention had acknowledged her words and accepted them. In the corridor outside, Ethan heard the magnetic locks release all at once, one after another, a chain of heavy clunks running down the annex like winter breaking. On the central feed, intake hall heaters rose another 10% as command overrides failed and maintenance redistribution became the new priority by force of something no administrator could appeal. The taller officer in the base slowly removed his cap and held it against his chest, not out of protocol but because he seemed to have run out of lesser gestures. The shorter one whispered, "Will they come back?" Sorelia looked at the stars for a moment longer before answering. They never left. Then the light began to recede. Not vanish. Recede, like a tide pulling away from a shore it had already changed. The screens dimmed. The impossible depth behind the glass thinned into reflection again. The station sounds returned one by one. Ventilation hum. Pipe knock. Distant doors cycling open. Somewhere far below, a child laughed, brief and real and stunned by sudden warmth. The silver lines on Sorelia's clothing softened until they were only faint traces under dark fabric. She looked smaller then, more local, more like the woman Ethan had first seen behind the water tank, except nothing about her could ever be mistaken now. She crossed the room and stopped in front of him. Up close, her expression held something he had not seen there before. Not judgment. Not surprise. Respect, perhaps, though even that seemed narrower than whatever stood quietly in her eyes. Ethan realized he had no prepared words for the end of a night like this. So he used the only honest ones he had. That was a lot for a maintenance shift, he said. Sorelia looked at him for 1 second, then another, and the faintest curve touched her mouth, small as first light under a locked door. Yes, she said. But you were qualified. He let out a breath that almost became a laugh. When he looked down, he saw that the old heat pack wrapper still lay near the water-stained edge of the bench where he had dropped it hours ago. Beside it now rested a thin black band of metal, seamless, dark as deep space, the same impossible material he had glimpsed at her wrist. He did not see her place it there. He looked back up, but Sorelia had already turned toward the hatch. The corridor beyond was open, washed in steady light now instead of emergency red. Refugees, workers, med staff, and security all moved through it in a silence unlike fear, as though the station had been forced to hear itself and had not yet decided what kind of place it wanted to be in the echo after. Sorelia paused at the threshold without turning around. "Ethan Cole," she said. He straightened without meaning to. "Yes." For a moment she only stood there, framed by the ordinary corridor of a failing station that had, against all expectation, been given another dawn. Then she said, "You did not ask humanity to be spared. You behaved as if it should be." After that, she walked into the light and was lost among the people who needed warmth more than spectacle. Ethan remained in the repair bay a long time after, one hand resting on the old workbench, the black band cool in his palm, listening to the station breathe in its new silence. Outside, Cinder Gate was still cracked, underfunded, overcrowded, and painfully human. But somewhere in Intake Hall 1, children were sleeping warm. Somewhere above Mars, the stars had chosen not to turn away. And on the bench beside a dead scanner and an empty cup, a tired maintenance worker finally understood something the powerful had missed